What if I told you the most powerful empire in history, Roman Empire, was not built by war alone, not by swords, and not even by emperors, but by something far more powerful, behind a Roman victory, behind every grand monument, behind every emperor's rise, moving silently across continents, ships crossing dangerous deserts, marvins overflowing with goods from lenders, and at the center an angle with goods of known lands and what fed more power, the more for Rome. But here's the real question. What exactly was Rome producing that made it so powerful? And what was it secretly depending on from the rest of the world? Because the truth is, Rome didn't just conquer the world. At its peak, Rome was unlike anything the world had ever seen, a city of over 1 million people. Crowded streets, endless noise, constant movement. From sunrise to sunset, and long after dark, Rome was alive. Markets were packed. Workshops were burning. Ports were overflowing. This was not just a capital. This was a machine. A machine that demanded goods, and in return, produced them on a massive scale. Every corner of the empire was feeding into this system, and every citizen, rich or poor, was part of it. Because in Rome, everything had value. Deep inside the empire, far from the luxury of palaces, there were thousands of workshops. Hot, loud, relentless. Men, women, and slaves working side by side, shaping raw materials into something useful, something valuable, something that could be sold. Clay was turned into containers that traveled across seas. Liquids were produced in enormous quantities. Fabrics were woven carefully, thread by thread. Even the buildings themselves were products of this system. Massive structures didn't just appear overnight. They required planning, labor, materials, and organization. And Rome mastered all of it. This was not random production. This was industrial-level efficiency, centuries before industry even existed. Standardized goods, recognizable designs, consistent quality. Rome understood something most ancient civilizations didn't. If you control production, you control wealth. But production alone was not enough. What made Rome unstoppable was movement. An incredible network of roads stretching over 80,000 kilometers. Stone, paved, engineered with precision, built not just for armies, but for trade. And then there were the seas. The Mediterranean was not a barrier. It was a highway. Ships loaded with goods moved constantly, from one port to another, from one culture to another, from one world to another. Rome sat at the center of it all. Everything flowed toward it, and everything flowed out of it. But here's where things get interesting. For all its power, for all its production, Rome was not self-sufficient. There were things it simply could not produce, and those things became its greatest weakness. From the distant east, along the legendary Silk Road, came materials so fine, so luxurious, that Roman elites became obsessed with them. Delicate fabrics, unknown techniques, mysterious origins. No one in Rome knew how they were made, but everyone wanted them. From the lands of India and the deserts of Arabia came flavors and scents that transformed Roman life. Spices that could preserve food, enhance tasty, and display wealth in the most subtle ways. These were not just goods. They were status, and Rome was willing to pay anything for them. Even if it meant sending its wealth out of the empire. Gold and silver, the backbone of Roman wealth, were slowly leaving the empire, flowing eastward, in exchange for goods Rome could not replace. At first, no one noticed. The markets were still full. The elites were still living in luxury. The empire still looked strong. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Rome was becoming dependent, and dependency is dangerous. There was another truth, a darker one that powered everything. The Roman economy did not run on innovation alone. It ran on people. Millions of them, slaves taken from conquered lands, forced into labor, working in fields, in mines, in workshops. producing the goods that kept Rome alive. They had no freedom, no rights, no escape. And yet, without them, Rome would collapse. This was the hidden engine, the system behind the system. For centuries, this system worked. Trade flowed, production continued, wealth increased. But then, things began to slow down. Trade routes became unstable, enemies grew stronger, internal corruption spread, and most importantly, the balance was broken. More was leaving Rome than entering it. The economy began to strain. Prices rose, confidence fell, control weakened, and the machine started to fail. In the end, Rome did not fall in a single day. It didn't collapse because of one battle or one enemy. It fell slowly because the system that made it powerful became the same system that destroyed it. The production, the trade, the dependence, all of it turned against itself. And that is the real story of Rome. Not just an empire of conquest, but an empire of commerce. Because in the end, Rome didn't lose to an enemy. But what if I told you? Rome didn't just fall because of enemies at its borders. It fell because something inside it was already breaking. Slowly, silently, invisibly. The same system that once made Rome unstoppable was now pulling it apart, and almost no one realized it until it was too late. At its height, the Roman Empire was not just a country. It was a vast, interconnected system stretching across continents, from Britain in the north to North Africa in the south, from Spain in the west to the edges of the east. Everything was connected. Goods, money, people, and power, all flowing through a complex network. But here was the problem. The bigger the system became, the harder it was to control. Local regions started becoming more independent. Corruption began creeping into administration. Taxes became harder to collect, and slowly, the central authority of Rome began to weaken. Not in a dramatic way, but in small cracks that kept growing wider. At first, Rome had one major advantage: a strong and trusted currency. Roman coins made of gold and silver were accepted across the known world. They symbolized stability, power, trust. But as economic pressure increased, Rome made a dangerous decision. Instead of solving the problem, they tried to hide it. Coins were slowly debased. Less gold, less silver, more cheap metal. At first, no one noticed. But over time, people began to realize the value of money was dropping. Prices began to rise. Confidence started to fall. This was something Rome had never faced before. And once it started, it was almost impossible to stop. Trade was the lifeline of Rome. Without it, the entire system would fail. And that's exactly what began to happen. Pirates started attacking ships across the Mediterranean. Roads became unsafe. Merchants feared traveling long distances. The smooth flow of goods turned into a dangerous gamble. Imports slowed down. Exports declined. Markets that were once full began to feel empty. And when goods stopped moving, money stopped moving too. The Roman Empire depended on its ability to control its vast territory. But as time passed, that control began to slip. Border regions became unstable. Local leaders started acting independently. Communication became slower, weaker, and the empire's grip loosened. Even the great trade routes that once brought luxury goods from the east became unreliable. The famous Silk Road was no longer as secure as before, and the steady stream of valuable imports from places like India and Arabia began to shrink. Rome was no longer the center of a perfectly functioning world. It was becoming isolated. For centuries, Rome had relied on external goods, luxury items, raw materials, rare products, things that made life in Rome richer, easier, more advanced. But now, that dependence was turning into a burden. Without steady imports, the elite lost access to the goods that defined their status. Without materials, production slowed down. Without trade, the entire economic system weakened. Rome had built a global network, but it had also made itself dependent on it. And when that network began to fail, Rome had no backup. As the economy weakened, the effects began to spread. Soldiers demanded higher pay, but the state had less money. Citizens faced rising prices, but their incomes stayed the same. Farmers struggled to survive, merchants lost confidence, and slowly chaos began to grow. Revolts broke out in different regions. Power struggles became more frequent. Leadership became unstable. The empire that once controlled the world was now struggling to control itself. Rome's military had always been its strength, but now it was becoming a burden. Maintaining a massive army required enormous resources, food, weapons, salaries. And as the economy weakened, these costs became harder to manage. At the same time, threats from outside increased. Germanic tribes pushed against the borders. Conflicts intensified, and Rome was forced to spend more while earning less. A dangerous imbalance. Rome was once a city of life, energy, movement. But over time, that energy began to fade. Trade slowed, jobs disappeared, people left cities in search of survival. Urban centers that once thrived began to decline. Workshops closed, markets shrank, infrastructure deteriorated. The very heart of Roman economic life was weakening. Rome didn't fall overnight. There was no single moment, no single event that ended it all. Instead, it was a slow process, a gradual breakdown of systems, a chain reaction of problems, each one making the next worse. Economic instability led to political instability. Political instability led to military weakness. Military weakness led to further economic decline. A cycle that Rome could not escape. And in the end, the empire that once connected the world could no longer hold itself together. The flow of goods stopped. The flow of money collapsed. The system broke. Not because Rome lacked power, but because it lost balance. The balance between production and consumption, between imports and exports, between control and expansion. And when that balance was gone, so was Rome. Because, in the end, empires don't fall when they run out of enemies. They fall when they run out of stability.